After a 17-day search, the hope of finding the missing 9-year-old alive was dwindling. Meanwhile, this little survivor was using her wits against her abductor. Inside of a concrete underground bunker made just for her, Katie Beers would be rescued, even when no one expected this to be a survivor story. Yet there she was, down a 6-foot tunnel in the darkness of a coffin-like room, waiting for them. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, and this case, it is one of those where the survivor truly had to overcome the abductor, but not in a physical manner, in a psychological manner, and she really had to manipulate and decide how she was going to get this abductor to let her go, even though she was only 9 years old at this point. I also want to thank our sponsor, MyHeritage. MyHeritage is an easy-to-use global family history and DNA service, and it only takes about 2 minutes. You can not only get an ethnicity estimate, but you can find new relatives that you didn't know about. You can build a family tree, and they said that they have a privacy policy where they never sell or license genetic data. Okay, so I just got my results back from MyHeritage DNA. Let's check it out. I'm 23.4 Scandinavian, 68.8 English. Well, I knew I was going to be some sort of Irish, but at 3.6%, that's crazy. Something like this can be so helpful for not only missing and kidnapped children, but also blended families or adopted children who have no idea about their background. And it can be so fun to just experience more about yourself if you do know some of it. You know, family members don't remember everything. You lose touch with different family members throughout life. And so you will learn so much more than you could have ever expected. But MyHeritage is having a promotion right now. All you have to do is click the link in the description box or use the code on the screen for free shipping. Now let's get back to the story. So it was actually 1992 in New York, and Catherine Beers, who went by Katie, lived in Long Island as a 9-year-old with her 44-year-old mother, Marilyn, and her half-brother, John. Now, her mother had actually gotten pregnant with Katie during a one-night stand, so her father was never really in the picture, and her mother continued to be a single mother. Now, although her mother was supposed to be the one to take care of Katie and her half-brother, John, they were often looked after by a different couple, and this was actually their godmother, a woman named Linda, and then her husband, Salvatore. You see, Marilyn wasn't the best mother. She was often neglectful, you could say. She was an unemployed cab driver at the time, and so she didn't have much money to spend on the kids, nor was she actively out searching for jobs. And so when they had nowhere to go, they would go to their godmother, and some have called them aunt and uncle to Katie and John instead, so sometimes they will be referred to as aunt and uncle, but they would go to their house, and this was 39-year-old Aunt Linda and Uncle Salvatore. However, this was not a safe home for them either. At the time, nobody knew, but they were being abused there as well. And unfortunately, this did include sexual assault by Salvatore. But this was not only sexual abuse, but emotional, physical, verbal abuse of all kinds, and Katie and John would be forced to do things like chores and cooking and everything around the house as young kids, and they were treated as servants. These children were enduring horror, and they had no one to confide in. The actual parental figure didn't care enough, really just didn't do enough to keep them, and so they were going to this home that was supposed to be better, and it was just worse. Katie was in school at the time. She only made it to class every 1 or 2 days a week, though still none of the teachers said anything about this. No one came to her rescue, and CPS was said to visit at some points, and I'm not sure if they were visiting the aunt and uncle's house or if they were visiting the mother's house, but either way, they never had any concerns, and so the children were never taken into a better place. And I tell you all of this because Katie was a survivor even prior to her kidnapping, and she had no idea that that strong girl she had become would end up saving her from her captor. Now, Katie was just about to turn 10 years old. Her birthday was December 30th of 1982. And so by December 28th of 1992, just 2 days prior to her birthday, she would end up vanishing. Now, police would be informed of this disappearance around the same time that Linda, her godmother, or her aunt would receive a voicemail from her. Now, on this voicemail, Katie could be heard saying, "Aunt Linda, a man kidnapped me and has a knife, and oh no, here he comes right now." And that is when she hung up. However, the police didn't know about this kidnapping because of the voicemail. They had been contacted previously because they had gotten a call from this arcade. It was Spaceplex, and it was about 16 minutes from Long Island where they lived, and police were told that a little girl had come in with this older man and that she could no longer be found at the arcade. And they were told that this 43-year-old man named John Esposito had gone up to them in a panic, saying that the girl he had gone there with had vanished. He didn't know where she had gone. And so this ended up being 9-year-old Katie Beers, and the search for her began. Except they could not find her in this arcade anywhere. And witnesses began to come forward to police to confide in them that they had watched John walk into the arcade that day, and there was no one with him. So when police were informing Katie's guardians at the time, her aunt and her uncle, and also questioning this man to figure out why he had Katie, why they were at the arcade, and what exactly happened to make her vanish, they would find out that John was actually the family friend of the aunt and the uncle, Linda and Salvatore. And according to Linda, the aunt, John Esposito had taken Katie to the amusement park, the arcade, that day as an early birthday present, and that Katie was so excited because she enjoyed being with John, whom she considered a friend. When the news broke, though, the articles that portrayed Katie were anything but sympathetic. They were portraying her as this attention-starved girl who would trust anything and anyone due to her living with her mother in a pigsty, which was really just a converted garage, that they didn't actually have a home. And neighbors were saying that, Katie would go out for late-night runs to get cigarettes for her caregivers. But the worst part was, it was claimed that her mother, Marilyn, actually knew about the sexual assault that her children were enduring by Salvatore since they were toddlers. And that she had actually once accused him of this, but it didn't change anything, and she continued to let them visit with these people. At the time of Katie's disappearance, it turned out that Marilyn was actually in a custody battle with Linda and Salvatore for Katie. And Linda was claiming during this time that Marilyn was an unfit mother. So police immediately began to suspect that there was something going on with this family friend that had randomly taken this 9-year-old, but they had no evidence of this at the time. And like I told you, even the abuse, just the physical, verbal, emotional abuse had been kept a secret, and CPS, they did investigations. They didn't uncover the truth. Nobody seemed to be deeply looking into any of this. But John was a suspect early on because he was the last one to have seen Katie that day. But that wasn't all. It was also the fact that he was a criminal. Now, John had been arrested 15 years prior for the attempted abduction of a 7-year-old in 1977 when he had attempted to take a young boy from a shopping mall. All of John's friends would come to his defense, saying that he was kind and he was always nice with the children, and that they allowed their own children to be with him. He was described as a quiet, caring person. He was a construction worker who lived with his family in Bay Shore on 1416 Saxon Avenue, and he had actually built his own apartment over their garage, which was a few yards from the main house. So they all lived on the same property, but not necessarily in the same house, but they did keep in communication through intercoms throughout the houses. Now, John was also known as Big Brother due to the fact that he was so close with young children, and he also left posters in bulletin boards in stores saying that he was inviting different boys to come over to his renovated garage to teach them things like how to work on cars. Hearing this and knowing his background, Obviously, this was of concern, and so the police decided to set up surveillance on John's property to watch his every move, and they actually set up on his property, not across the street looking over. They set up right next to him to let him know that they were watching. But little did they know how close they were to that missing girl. Though a search of his property gave no clues. They had searched the outside property, they searched the inside, and they had found no sign of Katie Beers. So when Linda had informed the police about the voicemail she had gotten from Katie, police did analyze this, and they found that it had come from the payphone near the arcade, but that hadn't been where Katie had actually spoken this. Due to the background noise that they couldn't hear on the actual voicemail, they believed that this was recorded elsewhere. But it was believed to be Katie's voice. Now, although these news articles were not the kindest towards Katie and her situation and almost blamed her for growing up in a bad environment, even though that was not her fault, there were searches happening from the police. And for 17 days, they had no leads. They kept an eye on John, on the family, but nothing was pointing to them. But 17 long days later, on January 13th, 1993, a man would enter his lawyer's office and confess to the abduction. However, this did not surprise anyone because police would be informed that John Esposito had finally admitted that he was holding Katie Beers captive. That's right, he was currently at that moment holding her captive. This was not in the past tense. He then gave them her location, and it turned out to be mere feet away from where they were holding the surveillance on John's property and feet below where they had searched inside. John would go into his home and show them that he basically needed to roll the carpet back in his office and use a block and a tackle to lift a slab of concrete that was a door. You see, behind a removable bookshelf in his office, it led to a 200-pound trap door that then led to a 6-foot tunnel to the ground. At the bottom of this tunnel was a 6 by 7 foot underground bunker, and inside of this bunker was a room that was soundproof, and then there was another room that was about the size of a coffin with a lock on it. Inside the coffin room, police would find a bed as well as a TV and Katie Beers chained inside. Police, though, were shocked that looking back at them was Katie Beers. They hadn't located just a body. They had located a survivor who was staring back at them after surviving 17 days in this coffin-like room going through who knows what kind of horrors. However, she would live to tell exactly what those horrors were. Katie was allegedly sitting there upbeat and bubbly and looking like she had just taken a trip back from the movies. She was in good spirits, and they knew at that moment she was going to be a survivor. And so during interrogation of John, he would admit that the bunker was built by him for Katie. That he had planned this for years. He had spent $5,000 on it, but he said that he never wanted to harm Katie. That he liked her. He loved her, really. But when police talked to Katie and heard the full story of her entire life, they knew that John was not the only one who needed to be charged and put into prison. You see, on October 16th of 1993, Uncle Salvatore, who does not even deserve that title, was arrested on charges of the sexual assault of Katie. He denied these charges, though, and was first released on bail, but Katie would end up testifying against him, and eventually he did receive 12 years. Now, on June 16th of 1994, John pled guilty to kidnapping in a plea deal that dropped the charges of sexual abuse of Katie and endangering the life of a child. Katie had been very honest with the police about the sexual assault that she endured during captivity by John, and yet he was never charged with this, nor would admit it. He would be sentenced to 15 years to life, and his fraternal twin, who lived on the property that his whole family did, said that he had, self-built this apartment and they had no idea that there was this tunnel or dungeon or this little girl there. By 2009, Salvatore did die while he was in prison, so he ended up never being released, and in 2013, on the 20th anniversary of Katie's rescue, a 31-year-old Katie Beers ended up telling her story in her own words in her book, co-written by reporter Caroline Gusoff. And Katie would describe how she survived those 17 days and how she was the reason that she was ever rescued. But at first, she would speak a bit about her past prior to abduction, and she admitted that she should have been placed in foster care by the age of 2 years old. That she would often lie to CPS when they would come to her house because they were questioning her in the same exact place that the abuse was happening, where the people who were abusing her were watching her. It wasn't an environment where she felt like she could speak out. Though she has admitted that because she went through all of that as a kid, she survived, that she would not have survived. She wouldn't be where she is today if she hadn't gone through all of that. Now, while she was being abused by her aunt and uncle and neglected by her mother, she was also being kept away from society at this point. And the only other interaction that she really had was the family friend of the aunt and the uncle named John. And this was like a treat to her. She got to see someone from the outside world. She knew him as Big John, and they were good friends. A man she did not realize was sexually assaulting her brother at the time. Now, like I told you, this abduction happened 2 days prior to Katie's birthday. And so Katie said on the day of the abduction, John had told her that he had birthday presents for her, one being a Barbie dream house. And so he ended up asking Linda if he could take her to the arcade. Now, Linda said yes. And Katie would admit that John would often buy Linda things. And this made Katie really be that person that was always just given to John whenever he wanted. That Linda, in order to keep receiving, used Katie as a prize for John. Now, Katie would admit that she went with John that day and they went to buy a video game. They had allegedly briefly gone to the arcade, and then they went straight to John's home. Now, Katie would go there often, and she, at this point, was playing that video game in his bedroom. And that day was really no different than any other day that she was there. But then she would tell him no to his unwanted and horrific sexual advances. And that was when she was dropped down a hidden, pitch-dark tunnel. For those 17 days, Katie endured a lifetime worth of horror. A horror this 9-year-old was all too familiar with. Katie explained that John would come down that tunnel where she was unable to escape from, and he would bring her out to the larger part, but she was normally locked and kept in this coffin-like room. But he would bring her out, he would give her blankets and junk food, and then he would repeatedly sexually assault her, which we will not get into the details of. When John decided he was done, he would chain her back up in the coffin room and leave the bunker. Katie had actually found one of John's keys to that coffin room, and she ended up hiding it under her pillow so she could get out of the coffin room when he wasn't there, go into the bigger room, and she was searching for a way out every single time he was gone. The problem was she was so close to freedom, yet she couldn't escape through the tunnel and the trap door. They were extremely heavy, and her being just this little girl. So she would go out, and then anytime she would hear John, she would run back into the coffin room. But she ended up not even letting herself sleep because she was afraid of what John would do when she was asleep. But then she was even more adamant about not even closing her eyes because John was trying to take a picture of her where she looked basically deceased. And he wanted to send this to police so that they would stop looking for her. He said he was going to keep her forever, and so the police needed to just stop. And hearing this, that is when Katie decided she needed to do more to get out of that bunker. And so Katie was using the TV at the time, and she was allowed to watch the news, even reports about, her own disappearance and the searches for her, and they were still looking. And so she knew that if they stopped looking, that could be the end of it for her. So not only did she stop sleeping at all, so he couldn't take this picture, she also stopped eating because she was worried that he was going to put sleeping pills in her food that would make her fall asleep. This 9-year-old had those thoughts in her head. And she knew that her life depended on her not being able to sleep. At 9 years old, not eating, not sleeping, no sunlight, after searching for any possible way out and finding nothing, Katie Beers began to do the only thing that she really thought she had left. And that was to use her wits against her abductor.
You have to give them a reason to keep you alive, to want to keep you alive, and then you have to remember your reasons for wanting to stay alive and what you're fighting for.
Katie would explain in her book that she began to manipulate John at this point. She started asking him what the plan was for the future, how she was going to go to school, how she was going to go to work. She was trying to scare him into thinking about reality. However, she said at first this wasn't working. John was telling her that he would teach her everything, that he could provide for both of them, that when she was 18, he would marry her and have children with her, and that she did not have to worry about any of that they were going to be together forever.
During my captivity, I was asking John Esposito questions about how I was going to go to school, what I was going to do to survive. I wanted to get married and have kids, and he would always have witty remarks right away, like, oh, you'll have kids with me, you'll marry me, you'll do this with me. So I would always tell him, no, I don't want to do that. Finally, the last day of my captivity, I told him that I was sick and I wasn't feeling well. I think between the police department laying on him at his house all the time and my questions finally wore him down, and then me saying that I wasn't feeling well finally wore him down, so he decided to tell his lawyers that he was the one that had been holding me.
Due to those two forces combining, John would end up cracking, and then he would confess to his attorney what he had done. Katie was alive. She is the reason that she was rescued. Though what they didn't know is that when Katie heard the sounds of the men coming down for her rescue, she was terrified because she believed that more men were coming to sexually assault her. She was not happy. She was so incredibly scared. And it was only when she realized that they were there to save her that she began to relax. But if we know anything about survivors and trauma, we know that that relaxation that she felt at that time, that feeling of safety, is never going to be that full feeling of safety, because trauma survivors never really get to have that same nervous system response. They never get to feel completely at peace, even with therapy, even with so much healing work. They will always have a heightened sense of anxiety and fear because of what has been done to them. Over the years after being rescued, Katie realized that she had witnessed her own bunker being built and had no idea. She had played in the dirt that John had removed from the ground in order to build it. She was going over there as he was building it and preparing to kidnap her, and all that time no one protected her. No one noticed anything, and if they did, they didn't do anything about it. They ignored all of the red flags, and all Katie Beers had was herself and her resilience, her bravery. And because of that, she survived a deranged and sick man.
From the time right after my captivity, I decided that I wanted to write a book. For then, it was more selfish reasons. I mean, what reason would a 10-year-old want to write a book? But then as I got older, it evolved to really wanting to help people and to show people that through tragedy, as long as you have the right support system, counseling, and different things like that, that you can overcome. You have to have the right mindset to overcome. And that's one thing that my support system was able to give me. Abuse needs to be talked about, what spectrum it needs to be talked about, but abuse needs to be talked about in school at an early age where kids can feel comfortable and know that this is my body, this shouldn't be happening. And I think that from when I was in school, the minimal time that I was in school in my early years, I don't remember that ever being talked about. Maybe if that was talked about when I was going through my abuse, I might have spoken up sooner because I would have known. My hope is that I am able to work with different organizations to shed more light on the subject of child abuse and to be able to give victims a voice, whether it's victims from years past that are just getting the courage to come forward, or if it's giving little kids the courage and knowing that they need to come forward if something is happening.
Now, once John and Salvatore were in custody, Katie was placed in a foster home, and she actually adored this family. They loved her. She had siblings to play with, and she was explaining that for the first time she got to play. She didn't have responsibilities. She didn't have to, do chores or be a parent or be an adult. All she had to do was do her homework and ride her bike, and she actually gives those foster parents credit for saving her life. Now, in her book, Katie actually admitted that she spoke to John while he was in prison, and according to True Crime Daily, she claimed that he said, "I know I'm guilty of my crime, but I believe I've been punished enough. I mean, I didn't kill anyone, and when I started my crime, I really thought it would be good for both of us." Now, I'm not sure how Katie responded to this or if she responded at all, but truthfully, that is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. But on September 4th of 2013, a 64-year-old John Esposito was found dead in his cell in Sing Sing prison, allegedly from natural causes. Now, this is quite speculated upon because he died hours after a parole hearing where he admitted for the first time that he inappropriately touched Katie Beers. He allegedly told the court that when he was first convicted, his attorney told him not to admit to anything but kidnapping, but that he now realized that it was a mistake and he shouldn't have listened to him. He said that he had touched Katie, but he had never admitted that before, and then later that day he was found unresponsive in his cell, and his death was said to be due to heart disease. Now, when Katie heard about John's death, she told the Associated Press, "While I am happy that John Esposito has finally admitted to touching me inappropriately, I am saddened by the fact that even after 20 years, he is still minimizing what he put me through during my 17 days in captivity." She also mentioned, "I'm saddened at the loss of life, but at the same time, I'm happy that John Esposito will never be granted parole or have the opportunity to hurt anyone ever again." I love that in both those statements, she very adamantly said his full name, John Esposito. She appears to have really taken that power back. But today, Katie Beers is actually a motivational speaker who says the best part of her story is reminding people that you can recover, you can persevere, and your life is 100% what you make it to be. She has done the work in therapy to address her past, and while writing her book, Katie actually allowed herself to re-experience the memories. And this was hard because part of her coping mechanism was to block out the entire experience.
During my captivity, I was not only physically abused, I was also sexually abused and raped by my captor. Somebody who prior to the abduction had never laid a hand on me. I never knew until years later that he had actually molested my biological brother, and people in my family had known about it. During my captivity, he deprived me of sunlight, nourishing food, personal hygiene, and kept me basically in a coffin-sized box for 17 days while being chained by my neck. I definitely think that part of the way that I was able to get through and survive the abduction was by the abuse that I sustained as a young child at the hands of my godmother and my godmother's husband. I also think that part of it, I was born with a skill almost to be able to endure that much pain that I had gone through my entire childhood. And lastly, I think that my desire to go back and live again with my biological mother kept me going. I think part of the reason why I was able to work through my abduction and my childhood is because my foster parents kept me out of the media spotlight. They allowed me to live a normal childhood. I was quickly enrolled into counseling, and the therapy greatly helped me to be able to talk about the emotions and to overcome a lot. I don't know when I was really ready to go public. I still think that January 13th of this year, I still was a little apprehensive about being thrown into the media eye, but it was something that I wanted to do to be able to let victims know that they do have a voice and that they can recover. I recently co-authored Buried Memories with Carolyn Gussoff. In Buried Memories, I talk a little bit about how I was feeling at the time of the abuse, how I was embarrassed and ashamed about the abuse. I felt like it was my fault. It took me a long time to actually realize that the child abuse, the sexual abuse, the rape, the neglect were not things that were my fault. They were out of my control.
Katie is now said to be living in Pennsylvania with 2 kids, and she's working in insurance. She is married, and she says that her life is exactly what she wants. But she is actually very vocal about the extreme trauma recovery that she had to go through and that is needed with kidnapping survivors. Not only is Katie Beers a survivor, but she's an advocate for giving survivors the right resources to heal. So please go support her book, go support her efforts, and keep her in your thoughts. This 9-year-old girl did the unthinkable because nobody was thinking of her. Nobody protected this girl. Not even the program that calls itself Child Protective Services, which we know doesn't do that in most cases. But there were so many different areas that this girl was betrayed, neglected. I can't even imagine how her half-brother John felt at the time too. He was enduring all of this as well, and I just hope that he is getting the help that he deserves as well. But it is just sad to me that Katie can even see that she should have been in foster care from the age of 2. If she knows that her home life was so bad that she would have rather been ripped away from her family or anyone she knew at 2 years old, that is so telling. And that just goes to show that these kids, they do know what's best for them. And a lot of the times in foster care, they are not asked for their opinion. They are not listened to. They are not given the proper time or environment to tell the truth. And I think if we just listen to these children more, we'd realize that due to what they are going through, they are so much smarter than we give them credit for, and they should be able to have a say in what happens to them. Now, I'm not saying that, at 2, at 5, at 9, Katie would have told a social worker, I want to be in foster care, because like she explained, it was something she didn't feel like she could talk about. But if somebody would have just listened to maybe little things she was saying, to the actions that were going on, I think it would have been very easy to see what Katie wanted, to realize what was going on. But nobody cared enough to look. And the fact that Linda let her husband do these horrible things and then let this friend of theirs do these horrible things, knowing what these 2 men were doing, and she still allowed it, she still, in fact, just gave Katie to them, despicable. It makes me want to throw up. That this woman did not have one motherly bone in her body to protect Katie. And that's what Katie deserved, was protection. And I'm sure Katie is the best, most protective mother out there. But without her bravery, without her being able to think through the situation, she wouldn't have been rescued. She is the reason for her own rescue, and that is just incredible. A 9-year-old girl. Imagine yourself at 9. Most of us wouldn't have been able to think that way. But she had to. She had no choice. She didn't have a choice from a very young age. So I just wish her all the best now, and I hope she's living an absolutely wonderful, beautiful, safe, protected life. So leave her all the love that you can down below, and don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay. Bye.